so welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking on how to make financial statements with Power BI, specifically focusing, there's kind of a part one and part two. So part one is talking about the profit and loss and the balance sheet. I have another talk where I go into the cash flow, which is a slightly different beast because it's like, you need to have the profit and loss and balance sheet before you can produce the cash flow, right? For those, yeah? It's not at SQL Bits, but if you vote, come back next year and you will see part two. It could be some time for your business to wait, right? No, I do actually have a recording of part two online, actually. So I can actually post it. If you actually Google Bob Duffy cash flow, you might find it on Google. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Duffy. I am old, right? I've been doing this a long time. I'm a Power BI fast track architect, a SQL Server ranger that used to be called architect, an analysis service Maestro. I used to work at Microsoft, and I now work for the best boss in the world, which is my good wife here, right? More importantly, I help enterprise customers implement data warehouses, usually on top of ERPs, for financial analytics. So I spend a lot of my time actually working with financial accountants, which is where the basis for this kind of talk comes from. On the right-hand side, these are the sort of ERPs that we've implemented Power BI on top of for various customers. So we've experienced some of this. As a joke, I put AdventureWorks at the bottom because actually AdventureWorks, as you watch AdventureWorks 99% of the time, it's got reseller sales and internet sales, and you're like, it's a sales demo, right? But actually, there's another set of tables that is an ERP built into AdventureWorks that actually has a chart of accounts and a general ledger and everything else. So I use that for my demos. So everything that you can see that I'm doing, I've made into a Power BI that I've actually put on GitHub that you can actually download. So you can reverse engineer everything that I've done here. I will give you the source code, and there's a link at the end of the document that you can download it. So this is what we're going to be covering. Basically, some of the challenges on making financial reporting and some of the solutions that we use. Okay, so I'll start off with what is financial reporting. The first thing is there's no fancy data visualization in this. This is not a data visualization talk, it's a modeling talk. And when you're working with financial accountants, they need to see their financial statement in a tabular format before you get fancy. Save all your fancy stuff for sort of drill downs and drill throughs. If you can't produce that pro forma statement, you are fired, right? So don't go with an opening shot, all these tables are old. If you had a bar chart, it would look much better. No, right? You don't do that when you work in kind of finance, right? So typically, your finance data will come in a number of modules that can be exported from your ERP. Hopefully, you might have a general ledger, AP, AR, stock, and there'd be lots of other modules depending on the size of the ERP. The one that we're most interested in is the general ledger. And from the general ledger, we get what I call the holy trinity of the reporting. You should be able to produce your sort of profit and loss, balance sheet, and ultimately your kind of cash flow. If you can get those three core financial reports in front of your finance team, they're quite happy, and you can then kind of work on other things from there, right? Now, the main challenge is you're going to get a spec. This is what we want to produce, and it will always be in Excel, right? And it will look something like this, and I can put Excel formulas for this equals this, and what you will notice is a lot of subtotals, KPIs, this equals this plus this, or this equals that, this kind of minus this, or this equals this plus this, right? So the first thing I do is I restate it and I simplify that, right? Because most of what they have, say for example, they say net sales equals invoice sales minus returns, you could actually just say that that's a running sum of adding it up, right? So most of the balance sheet is actually running sums. Those subtotals they have are usually running sums, right? So I restate it in a simpler format and work from there, right? So the first set of table that you're going to get is the actual chart of accounts itself. There will be a table called account or COA or something like that. That will look something like this, right? This is the AdventureWorks. There will be a 4 or a 6-digit code that will be your GL code or your account code, which will be your business identifier for the account. And that's going to be the basis for the report, okay? And if you're lucky, the export will give you the dimensions that relate to the general ledger. So you can actually naively make up a Power BI model just by natively importing all of those, right? So that's what I've done for version 1, right? I've actually created Power BI dot. I've just natively sucked out the kind of Power BI work with almost no modeling work whatsoever other than kind of joining it. Well, I did a little bit of work on flattening in a hierarchy, but no complex DAX, no complex modeling. And you can produce saying, sometimes the native chart of accounts looks like a profit and loss. So with AdventureWorks, it kind of looks like a profit and loss, but it's not what the financial accountants are looking at. So the big mistake, number one, is thinking that the chart of accounts is going to produce your report for you by the information in it. It's not going to be rich enough to contain those subtotals, KPIs, and all the other things that they need. So it might produce the same numbers on what have I paid on tax, discounts, profit, but it's not going to be the format that they're kind of looking for. But it's a good starting point, right? We can see here that the AdventureWorks one is pretty messed up because the way it's exported, the costs come out as positive. So when you add them up, you actually get an operating profit that's wrong because it should be sales minus costs, right? And this is very common because of the way that things are stored internally with sort of debits and credits and ledgers. You could find costs come out as positive. So when you import it, you often have to invert them so that the kind of maths works out. Now that's usually done in Power Query or in the SQL side. You would not do that in DAX because from a performance point of view, you probably don't want to be paying that cost at runtime. So there's usually a little bit of cleaning of the kind of data. I'm not going to go in how to do that because that's very basic, right? What I am going to start off with is, I showed you a demo of what the naive one kind of looks like. It's not bad. It's got the dimensionality. One thing to mention here as well is your general ledger. This particular one has date, department. Your general ledger will probably have other dimensionality, like it could have product group, customer group. And one thing that you need to bear in mind is nearly every major ERP is flexible as to what the dimensions are. Because just because you've worked with one of the ERPs once, when you go to another customer, they probably have a completely different set of dimensionality, right? So you have to figure out what all the keys are and how they link into the dimension tables. So the first thing that you're going to need is a way to soft code the report structure. So for the financial report, this is what they want on the right-hand side of the screen. This is what we get on the chart of accounts on the left side of the screen. So I need to create this as metadata, and then I've got these calculated members that don't exist within the chart of accounts. So there's nothing in the chart of accounts that says net invoice sales or EBITDA or anything like that, right? I've got to calculate those, right? So the way that we do it is we create a spreadsheet that soft codes the report that they're looking for, okay? So it could be a spreadsheet, it could be a table in the ERP if it's that kind of flexible, but it's a metadata spreadsheet for every line you want on the report, and then what the operator is, sum, running sum, and so forth. And we could have 2, 3, or 4 operators in here, right? And then the challenge is, how do we map this to the chart of accounts, right? Now, there's 2 common ways that we do the map, right? If you're lucky, the chart of accounts has got something on it that is a grouping. It says, this is sales, this is discounts, right? I'm just working with a customer using Oracle Hyperion, and they've got exactly that, right? But other systems don't necessarily contain the richness to understand which account codes fit into which of the lines on the financial statement. But what they will have is the accountants might give you ranges of GL codes to say, well, this range from here to here is sales. This range from here to here is discounts. So think of these from an account numbers as like, if you were an IT person planning a network up into subnets, right? And you'd have this subnet for this building, this subnet for this building. Accountants do exactly the same with the GL codes, right? So they'll have ranges to say, well, this range is net sales, this range is variances. So we model that, and we say, this range links into this line on the report, right? Now, this is only if the chart of accounts doesn't have some sort of native way of grouping it, right? Some do and some don't. So that's the first thing that you've got to figure out is, what do they give me, right? Now, ultimately, regardless of how they supply the information, we always design this kind of model. So we have the chart of accounts here, but we don't use the chart of accounts for the report. We have something called a financial report or a statement that has those soft-coded lines, and then a bridge table that joins what you want to see on screen to what's in the chart of accounts, right? And this is the data engineering piece, right? So we need to create that many-to-many, that bridge table. That's not going to exist within the ERP, right? It's just used for Power BI for reporting purposes, right? Now, this is quite tricky to do the first time. I'll show you the basic algorithm, right? On pen, this table here, where's it gone? Where's my pen gone? So this table here, this is your statement, okay? So this is the soft-coded version saying, like, for this line on the report, this is a sum, this is a running sum, right? This table here is, and this is your rules table saying how they link, but just with the front. We step through it and say, well, line 1 on the report, just going to step through, line 1 on the report is from account codes 1120 to 1200. I find the account codes that are here, that's 2 of them. So I put 2 lines relate to line number 1, which is this one, pen, these 2 lines here. Okay, so that's a sum. I come to line number 2 on the report, trade sales is 1201 to 1250, and I say, oh, there it is, that's that one there. The next one is a running sum. A running sum is everything up until that point. So 3 is everything up until that point, which is 1, 2, and 3, right? So you can see the kind of math isn't that hard to build that kind of table up, right? But once I have that, I now have all of the logic to drive the report without any DAX. The storage engine is going to do all of the work of presenting it just by a join. Now, it is a many-to-many join, which is a bidirectional join. So if the Italians are in the room, they would be shaking their head, right? But the size of the statement is a couple of hundred rows, kind of typically, right? So we're not that worried about the kind of challenges of a bidirectional join here, right? I wouldn't worry about that at all. There's much bigger fish to fry, right? Now, there's 2 ways technically of creating this, right? One, you can do this. Say, for example, you have CSV files and you're loading up into Power BI. You can use Power Query or the M code to step through that kind of logic and create that kind of bridge table. And that's exactly what I do in the example that I've given you to actually download. I get the from and the to ranges, and I use the expand function to sort of amortize them out and bring that back into the many-to-many table. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the logic on this talk because, you know, it's a small piece of the puzzle, and there's a fully working version that you can actually download, right? Now, we do not typically do this in M, because typically we build larger enterprise data warehouses and we generally have a SQL Server underneath that, right? So we typically do it in T-SQL, say, right? And here that's quite straightforward. If I'm doing a sum, I'm just going to use the between clause on the thing to populate that kind of many-to-many table. If I'm doing a running sum, I'm going to join, but use where the second line is greater than the first line or whatever and get a running sum up until that point. So it's a non-standard join, but it's still fairly easy to do, right? The end result is what I create. So I'll show you the end result now, which is this model here. And this is what you can download from there. So what you'll see is the structure is exactly the same as the naive one, where I've just imported it, but we've got this extra 2 tables on that have the statement. Now the statement is just an import of my spreadsheet, which I could have brought into a SQL table first, which has the kind of metadata of what the line is on the report. And I always use 2 levels. I have a heading and I have a section, right? It's always a 2-level hierarchy, and I have an operator. And that tells me where the sum. And then I give that to the financial accountants. So they can now change the structure of their report by adding extra lines, by changing the definition of what's included in that without me, right? They can continue to do that in their own time, okay? And once we do that, the end result is we now get the profit and loss statement that looks exactly as they want it, with the headings. This is a ragged hierarchy, so there might be some elements are 2 level deep, some levels are only 1 kind of level deep, and you can see here that as part of the report we have the running sums. So we can see that gross sales less discounts, net invoice sales is going to be a running sum. Okay, so when I went to the bridge table, this is my bridge table. This would just all be populated by using that join, so there's no DAX needed other than a sum. There's no fancy calculations needed, and what you get from that is blistering performance, right? I mean, I've got enterprise profit and loss sheets rendering in 40 milliseconds, right? So, you know, it's not waiting 10 or 20 seconds for these DAX calculations to run, okay? So that's the basic structure there, and just to show you that it's not kind of magic, I can go to I could drag on an accountant can then do that by self-service, right? So if I drag on the GL amount, I can decide that I want to see that as, for example, a matrix. I can go to my statement, and I can say I want to see that by my hierarchy, and just drag that in there. I can expand the hierarchy out, and we do have this thing called a report, because we might have multiple reports. So I want my profit and loss. You can see I've now got my pro forma report exactly as they wanted it. So in a couple of clicks of the mouse, I can get what they wanted to. Now let's talk about some slightly more complex things. I think KPIs, formatting, and units of measure, right? So adding extra value on top of the base financial profit and loss here, right? So the first thing is you'll notice that some of these things, let's actually talk about formatting first, right? You'll notice that I've got a percentage here, but it just comes out as 0.26 because all of the numbers have the same formatting. So what I want is different rows to have a different formatting, okay? So we do this by using a calculation group. So the first thing that we do is in the metadata, we tell it what the format is if it's an override format. So there's a standard format and an override. So obviously if it's a percentage, I'm going to want to format that as a percentage. But it's quite hard in Power BI natively to have this one column but different rows having different formatting. So what we do is we use a calculation group. So if you haven't used the sort of tabular editor, that's an excellent add-on for sort of Power BI, and that lets you add calculation groups. Now I'm using the commercial version, but the free version lets you do that as well, right? So what I can do here is I can right-click, I can add a new calculation group, and I'm going to call that statement format. And it's going to give me a toggle to switch between formatted and unformatted. Now, the value is exactly the same. So see, there's a formula here which just gives me the selected measure, but you can dynamically change the format string. So what I'm saying here is I want you to change the format string to be whatever you find in the statement format. So it's now going to be dynamic, right? Now this is, I've added a few more bells and whistles here because I've said if you don't find it, go and look in another table as well. So I can have an override, and you'll see why I have an override on the format when we talk about units, right? So once you do this, you can then implement the ability to, when I go to the filters now, sorry, let's just go to my, here's when I put it, because I probably put the filters on. I can now change the statement format. So you see here the statement format's quite boring. I click here. It's now formatted, right, as the accountants wanted it, with this as a percentage. There's no decimal places and so forth. And I can toggle that, and I can change that because it's a soft coding. So if they say I want 1 dB, they can change that, right? I don't need to do any DAX coding. That's all for the accountants to do. So I give them control over their own kind of destiny, but also I can blame them if it's wrong now, right? so that's kind of good as well, right? Now, the next thing is, let's talk about units of measure, because on a large company where your revenue's in kind of billions, no one wants to see 10 kind of digits on their profit and loss. Like they won't say, no, I'm 1.2 billion, I'm 1.3 billion. So they need to switch the units of measure, but there might be a division in that company who's measuring it in a different unit, right? So what we do here is we create a floating table. Where's it gone? Yeah, get you back. There. Right, so I create a floating table called statement unit. And what I mean by floating table is just a table that's not connected to anything. I might have even created it in sort of Power BI. It doesn't even exist within the kind of SQL Server. It's just a calculate table. Okay? And here I have the units, noughts, thousands, and millions. I have a multiplier, a sort order, and a second format string. So if I haven't specified a format, I can now have a format string that dynamically changes as you change the kind of units. So if you flip into millions, you might want to see an extra decimal place, maybe, right? So it just gives you the flexibility to actually do that. And then this is where we start to have to add, unfortunately, a little bit of DAX, right? Now, the best solution is one that has no DAX, but you know, it's almost impossible, right? So you have to have some, right? So here, what I'm doing here is, you can see I've just got my base sum here, okay? And then I'm then dividing that by whatever the selected value. And if they don't pick a multiplier, this second parameter on the selected value is what is the default. So if they don't kind of pick one, I'm assuming it's in singles, right? Otherwise, what's going to happen is now, when I go to the report, as well as the statement format, I can now change the statement unit. I can say, I want this to be displayed in millions. So now, that's now displayed in kind of millions, right? Notice the little pièce de resistance there is the format changed to 2 decimal places as I switched to millions because it had that override in the table. Path back to the account. Oh, right. Great question. Yes. So because... Yes, yeah, sorry. I saw the question. No. Because you've used a statement, do you lose the ability to drill down to the account codes? Okay. And indeed to drill down to any of the dimensionality, because that's what you're going to want to do. The answer is no, because what you can do is on your profit and loss here, I've actually got the account code as an extra level. So if I really wanted to see what's underneath trade sales, I could expand that down to the account code or codes underneath that, right? So, and I might, did I actually implement? I haven't implemented drill down here, right? But what we usually do is we create another report that has the lowest level detail, so you can right-click, drill down to view that by department or by something else, right? So you can implement, there's no problem. Oh, here, look, I've got a drill through here. So here, I can drill through to implement that by department. I'm now going to see a breakdown of that by department. I could have a drill through by department, by account code, by whatever the dimensionality of the account was. So you don't lose drill down by having that higher level abstraction of the statement in front of the account, but what you get is that flexibility to have a different layout than the chart of accounts has, right? Now, this leads on to an excellent thing, which is KPIs, right? So far, most of the things I've shown you have been simple sums and running sums, right? But if you look at the financial statement, if you're doing statutory profit and loss, where it's just going to the regulator, that's all it's going to have, right? But if you're doing internal, they're going to want to see KPIs on there as well, right? So an example of that is this percentage. EBITDA percentage, so earnings before interest, tax, and amortization. What is the percentage of revenue? Because they're going to benchmark that versus last year, versus last period, versus this to see how well they're kind of doing. So they want to start to see these KPIs, right? So what we do to handle the KPIs is, again, we soft code those onto the statement. And there's a so when I go to the statement definition, you'll see not everything is a sum or a running sum. One of them here is a range, because they put something and they said this equals this plus this, but it's not a running sum and it's not a hierarchy. So it's a custom roll-up, right? So what we do is, on the statement, we have argument 1 and argument 2, right? Now I've called it calc 1 and calc 2. And this says, for this operator, take those parameters and do something, right? So this is saying, add up that one between that one and that one, right? And for KPI, and I robbed the wording fairly unapologetically from, there's an excellent blog, Imelka, who runs a blog called The BI Accountant. And what she noticed is 99.9% of KPIs that people ask for on financial statements take the previous row and do something with it, right? So we call it KPI previous row, saying take the previous row and divide it by something, which is usually revenue, right? So these KPIs, you'll see these lines start to appear. So to add the flavor, you're going to add extra operators to do extra bits that they want to do, right? KPIs, ranges, custom roll-ups. Now, initially, this is where you might have to write some DAX to actually implement those, because they're going to be calculated on the report. So that's what I've done here. So for this EBIT percent, right, you'll see that on the report, EBIT percent, there's my percentage. You'll see that this is the add one. You'll see that what I'm doing is I'm taking calc 1, calc 2. I'm just really doing an add by that and adding them up, right? So N1 kind of plus N2, okay? Other ones I'm doing, the previous row, where's GL amount? There. The previous row is a little bit more sophisticated. So what I'm doing is I'm calculating what the line was before the one that we're currently on, and then I'm getting that kind of value, and then, which is N, right, which is the nominator, and then for the denominator, I'm then calculating that by using what they've put in the argument to and finding that line on the report, dividing that, and getting the ratio out. So once we have that, we have dynamic ratios. And the beauty of this is they can put as many KPIs as they want on their financial statement now, just by updating all of the metadata, right? The bad news is I've now got DAX, right? And every switch statement that you add will nearly halve the performance of your financial statement. I'm not joking, right? I literally see it go from 50 milliseconds. I had one switch statement, it goes to 100 milliseconds. And you're like, well, that's still quite fast. Then I had another switch statement, it goes 200 milliseconds. You're like, okay, it's starting to slow down. And then they add 20 columns. And at 200 milliseconds times 20, now you're starting to get a slow report, right? So every bit of DAX does hurt. So we've just done some work that's not in this talk, unfortunately, of taking those KPIs and calculate as much as possible before it hits the report to improve the performance, right? Now let's look at some other calculations. This is one that really frustrated me the first time I saw it, EBITDA, right? The problem with EBITDA, right, is they love to do this where they show you the report that has depreciation and they say, oh, can I see it excluding the depreciation? So the depreciation, which is only once in the general ledger, is now twice on the report once it's been added back. So once as a negative and once as a positive, right? I'm like, well, why didn't you just put the EBITDA before the depreciation? But you can't tell a financial accountant how to change his order on in things, like that's just not on, right? So what we do there is we have the ability to put an operator to say this equals that, but inverted signage, right? So you'll see in the kind of metadata, and then this is then the previous row. And I'll just show you that in the metadata. You see that when we come to EBITDA, where's EBITDA? Can't see it. Oh, so it's actually in a different. There you go. You'll see I'm using the add, saying, well, add that, and this is just the KPI on the previous row, right? So now we can do any variation. Now that leads me on to the other flavor that we have, versioning, right? You'll see here, often, when I first started, I was very naive. I thought there was only one profit and loss that the whole organization used. And then I realized there's different countries, there's different accountants in different teams, there's a manufacturing set of accountants, and they all have arguments as to what is included where on the statement. So one guy's below the line is another guy's above the line, right? So different teams want different versions of profit and loss, right? And you've also got statutory versions, internal versions, and summary versions, right? So what you can do with this kind of metadata approach is you get the perfect kind of profit and loss, copy your spreadsheet, paste, give a different name, change it, and just change the name of the report to another code. So I've got a profit and loss version, and then I want another version, which is exactly the same, but it removes the below the line stuff that internal people aren't interested in. Like internal people might not be interested, how much tax did we pay, right? Because you've charged your VAT and you've paid it back. It's not part of the running of your kind of business, right? So you don't want to see that, but you do want to see some more ratios. So what this type of design pattern allows you to do is now, this is my standard profit and loss. I can copy and paste that page, just change the report from the profit and loss to the EBITDA, and I now get a different structure on the report. So this is my EBITDA report, which is no behind the line boring stuff, you know, interest, taxes and stuff like that, but it does have extra calculations. Whereas my standard profit and loss that maybe I show to other people looks like this. So it doesn't have EBITDA, but it does have interest and tax on it, right? So you can see how you can create different versions of the report. This has also proved very useful where the accountants have come to us and said, we're planning a new version of the profit and loss in 3 months' time. Can you show us what that would look like now? So what we do is we then have a toggle switch where they can toggle between the new and the old version, and when the kind of date comes, all we do is change the kind of filter in the reports, and now the new version of the profit and loss is shown, right? So that report versioning is a handy feature of the metadata, right? Now, once you get the perfect model then that has those calculations in it, just a few KPIs, you know, ratios and previous row are your two. If you just implement those two, you are smoking, right? Because 90% of the stuff is just based on those two. You can then you'll find that the model then looks very good in Excel. So if I click on Analyze in Excel, the first thing they're going to ask for you after you make your lovely Power BI model is, can I see it in Excel? Right? So by using Analyze in Excel, you'll see you can get the exact same structure, exact same kind of layout, but still with the same functionality. So I can change my unit of measure, I can turn on or off formatting, and so forth. And obviously, one of the advantages of Excel is they can then control how to do the analytics and the drill downs. They might want to see, I want to see a breakdown by month on my columns or something like that. So you get 2 for the price of 1 when you've got the correct model there. Okay, now let's move on. So we talked about how to do those basic KPIs, and I like the idea of letting them say this comes from the previous row to help them define the kind of metadata. We've talked about how to do EBITDA, how to add back depreciation and then have a KPI on that. And those are sort of KPIs that you'll be implementing. We also showed you how to do versioning. That's very important when we come to talk about the balance sheet, because people tend to have different versions of the balance sheet, quite common. So as an example, here's 2 different versions of the same balance sheet. In one of them, it's missing a heading, so it's not current assets. I'm assuming that's non-current assets, like long-term assets, current assets. But in the new version on the right-hand side, they just want all fixed assets kind of lumped in one kind of group. So they want to change the grouping, right? It's the exact same set of data, but the layout on the balance sheet they want is completely different. So to do that is very straightforward. You just fill in all the metadata for the kind of balance sheet, and then copy and paste it, change all the groupings around, and have a new report code that you can then dynamically switch. Before I show you a demo of that, there's just a few things to bear in mind on the kind of balance sheet, right? Which I come to here. There's 2 typical ways that balance sheets are implemented. The main difference between the balance sheet and the profit and loss is the balance sheet is talking about closing balances of accounts, right? How much money do I have in my bank account at the closing balance, not the movement, right? Whereas the profit and loss is about the movement. So there's 2 ways of calculating this. Really old and small systems will make you calculate that by summing up overall time. So AdventureWorks kind of uses that, right? No major ERP would make you do that, right? Because it would be suicide. Because if you sum up overall time, a single corruption in history corrupts the current set of accounts. And ERPs aren't as integral as you'd hope, right? So you don't want to design an algorithm where if even a single row of history gets corrupted, the current and future also gets kind of corrupted. So what they typically do is they produce snapshot tables where they say, well, this is the kind of balance as of, and then a date. And that's the more traditional way that a modern, if you were to use SAP or any of the ERPs that we had at the front, they would traditionally have balance tables, and you would use that. So you wouldn't use the general ledger. There would be a separate table that had a balance on it. If you did only have a single table, then here's an example of closing balance calculation. You can go to DAX Patterns, any of the sites, and they will have this type of calculation on it. So you can see that I'm just kind of summing up overall time. And once you do that, you can then design the balance sheet in exactly the same way that you designed the profit and loss. So I go to my statement, go to my spreadsheet, didn't come up. And then go to my balance sheet, and I'm just going to design all those. It's still going to have the exact same structure. It's going to have that many-to-many table between the GL codes and the statement. And then when I render it on the report, let's go to my balance sheet. You can see I've got this here, non-current assets, current assets. With a flick of a button, I can change that to be, I think I put a slicer on the report here. See this? Change that from the balance sheet to the balance sheet too. And that's now completely different, but the same kind of figures, it's just presented a different way, right? Now the last thing I want to show you is probably dynamic targeting, right? So we have a standard report here, right? Are they going to ask us for only 3 columns? No, right? They're going to be like, I want the amount, I want the budget amount, I want the variance, I want the percentage variance, I want the amount in the previous year, and I've got a forecast, I've got a forecast plus 1, I've got a forecast plus 2, I've got a plan, and I want to compare to any one of those, right? That's more typically the scenario that I would see, right? So there's a few ways of doing this. Here's an example of a dynamic target. So what we do is we take a scenario dimension that has all the scenarios. And what I mean by a scenario is actual, budget, forecast, forecast plus 1, forecast plus 2. And then we create a measure called target. And depending on the scenario that you pick, say I've got forecast, I can change that to budget or forecast plus 1. And the numbers will then dynamically change. So they can pick what they want to see on there as the forecast moves on, because each year they will be changing that, right? So that's kind of one option. Yeah?
What happens when they want to compare 2 different targets?
Great idea. So usually, like the Pareto principle, they want to compare one target to the actual, right? But there does get a scenario where they want to compare forecast 1 to forecast 2 to see what's changed, right? And in that scenario, what you do is you have 2 scenario dimensions, a source and a target. And your DAX will then, you will then need to write some kind of DAX to say, calculate me the value based on the source, calculate me the value based on the target, and the difference between them is the variance, right? So that's we do have a couple of customers who do exactly that, right? But usually on a P&L, you're comparing multiple targets to the actual. So that's kind of how that works. Now, now this first kind of technique is okay, but I'm going to ask a question. This lets me pick a scenario. What if they wanted to see budget and forecast, right? Suddenly this doesn't work so well, right? So this is something we've just started using. Field parameters is a relatively new feature in, well, I say kind of relatively new. I'm kind of so old that like a year or 2 feels like new, right? But what this lets you do is in the modeling section, you can define field parameters, and what you do is you create a measure for every single possible thing. Hide it if you want to. So you've got forecast value, forecast plus 1 value, forecast 2 plus 10 value, budget value, forecast variance percent, right? So you could have like 30 measures, right? And then in here, you pick which measures you want to appear on the reports or to have available. So I'm going to have the amount, budget, hopefully I'll put a little navigation folder to make it easier. I want to put the forecast, the variance and forecast, the percentage forecast, but I also want the plus 1 variance as well. So you create this, and it creates a calculated table, okay? And then in this one then, you could, if you wanted to, dynamically pick the columns, right? So I can go, so I've created a calculated table here that I called P&L columns. So I'm saying, hey, what columns do you want on the report, right? And using that, they could, if they wanted to, go to the P&L columns and say, hey, I want to click the individual columns that I want on the report, right? Now, now, the problem with this approach is if there's 30 options, they've got to go through a list that's 30 things and say, I want this, this, and this, and this, this, and this. I mean, it's not bad, right? But what they really want to say is, I want to see the actual scenario, the budget scenario, and have 4 columns drop in that match that group, right? Here's a hidden trick that I don't know if I invented it, but I woke up one kind of morning and I couldn't find anyone else who'd blogged about it, so I'm claiming that I invented it, right? But I'm guessing I probably didn't, right? What you can do is when you go through the wizard and you create a field parameter, it looks exactly like this. It creates a 3-column table that looks like this, right? With the P&L columns. That looks like this. So this is all done by the wizard. So it automatically creates this. Now what I did do is it calls it name I called it P&L kind of column because kind of name's a bit too sort of generic. So I just kind of renamed it, right? You'll notice that what I then did is I added a fourth column on there, because what I found is when you go to the definition of the table, there's nothing that stops you from adding extra data to the field parameter. And what you get from that is a way to group the columns into logical groupings, so that when I click budget, I get these columns. When I click forecast, I get these columns. When I click something else, I get another columns. And you can duplicate them to say, when I click on budget, I want to see actual, but when I click on forecast, I want to see actual as well, right? So you can decide how to group the scenarios on your report. And what you then get is this nicer experience where they can effectively click, and groups of them will appear at once. So when I click kind of budget, I get 3 or 4 columns or 5 columns, and I can control and select and say, I want to see budget and forecast, or budget and forecast plus 1. So that's the, that's something that you can use if there's a lot of columns that they want to dynamically pick at runtime and they don't just want a fixed format. Okay, so that was probably the last thing I wanted to show you. So before, don't even get time for questions. No, we do. We have at least 60 seconds for a question. Let's go back to our presentation. Yeah, so in kind of summary there then, yeah, obviously there's a lot of advantages that we call the secret sauce of making it, that kind of metadata driven approach of putting the statement into saying that the accountants, now, depending on how you trust them, right? Some accountants we found are very trustworthy. They have kind of change control and they treat the kind of metadata spreadsheet very kind of sacred and they back it up before changing it. Other ones are sort of gung-ho and they break the production system. So you have to say to them, no, we'll change it for you and you kind of give us a sheet and we're them, right? So it's up to yourself. I'm not going to advise how to do the kind of DevOps of the kind of changes, right? But you get a lot of advantages of things that you can do to make your profit and loss more dynamic and more flexible and more faster, right? And the good news is all ERPs really give you the same sort of structure of data. Like, you know, although they're different brands, when you look from a data modeling point of view, they're all so similar that the general design pattern works for all of them, okay? So now, if you want to get hold of that, there is this first link is the GitHub link, which is to the financial, there's a GitHub, ProData SQL financial modeling, and you can download the PBIX that I have here. And there's a couple of blogs that are useful that dive into a little bit more detail on some of the things, like the expansion of how to use the many-to-many table. I've just got a blog site that just focuses on just that bit. But one of the best ways to learn is just to reverse engineer a finished product, right? So this is the finished product. You can quite happily go into the transform kind of data and you can see how did we build this report account map to give us the many-to-many, I'm sorry, that's not the report account map here, to give us that kind of many-to-many table. How do we build that up? You can go back and you can see the actual M code that was used to actually do that. You can also see we do actually have a cash flow in here. So this is a cash flow reconciliation where we're taking the movement of cash on the profit and loss, and comparing it to the closing balance minus the opening balance on the profit and loss at a basic level, right? So this is an example of using a cash flow report for reconciliation. So that's all included in that example. If it helps you get kind of started or sort of generates any ideas, happy days, right? But that's not seen as a production finished example. That's just an approach, right? So it's something that could be useful. Okay, that is me. I'll open the floor for any. Yeah, we just got time for one or two questions. Yeah.
Do you also have a trick to change the formatting of the subtotals, for example?
Of the what?
grey background or something.
Ah, right. Great idea. Using the formatting, yeah. So is there a way to change the formatting of totals? I believe that in the format pane, depending on how you've done it as a hierarchy, there is a subtotal element, I was fairly sure, in the format pane there. Yeah, on the format here, see the row subtotals here. Yeah, I don't know if you change the background color. You can certainly do it at the column level, but that depends how you've made up the report. If you've only got a single column, that's fine. But if you've got that approach I showed of having the 30 different columns, then that's going to be there. So we just tend to try and convince the accountants to go with this format of having it bold and not having fancy colors, to tell you the truth, right? So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm hoping there's a way to actually do that. Was there another question there?
When you showed us the account ranges,
Yeah.
Is it possible to handle exceptions like we have this range, but not this part, not this account?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what happens. Think about IP ranges where they say it's 1 to 100 and they fill their range and they need a new one, right? So the question is, if we have a range and they have something that's not that range, what do we do? So all we do is in our rules table have 2 lines from that range to that range and from that range, and a range can actually just be a single value. So yeah. Okay, that is time. I will be hanging around outside by the, I think there's a little seated area there, and I'm going to go to the downstairs as well if anyone has any further questions, or follow me on Twitter, Bob_Duffy. Thank you very much.